Hello and welcome to ThePrint softcover Sohini. This is a book that I'm holding. This is Sohini's book that you can see. It's bright red like the blazer that I'm wearing today. I chose to basically twin with the book today. Also happens to be my favorite color. But coming back, this is, Ramchandra sir has already said it on right in the beginning, and it's one of the finest works of nonfiction I've read in years. And I would just say that I understand why he said that, because I finished the book in more or less one go for me, which is like a rare feat when it comes to nonfiction. But first, welcome, Sohini, and congratulations. This is such a fascinating book, especially for somebody even like me who probably doesn't know a lot about sports. And I learned so much from this.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for having me, and thank you for reading me at one go. And thank you for all the kind things you've said. And I think Ramchandra Guha has also been very generous. I don't know if I deserve it, but it sounds good.
Okay, so let's start with the element that you've sort of infused, which is what maybe makes it stand out from a lot of other nonfiction books, which is beginning with like a very personal moment in your life and how you're dealing with especially grief. And then it pans on to these amazing athletes that we come to know of. Many I had no idea about, very frankly, probably because again, you've mentioned the underreportage or how they have been erased, how there has been systemic exclusion of a lot of these people. So let's start with that element, that narrative device that you've chosen, and then we can proceed.
So I, like most upper middle class, or shall I say middle class Indians, I was not encouraged to go into sport, and specifically women are not. In the last 20 odd years, we've seen a little bit of, I'm very grateful to the parents of Saina Nehwal and Sindhu and all these people who are sending their kids to badminton schools, and Sania Mirza's parents. But I grew up slightly earlier, and PT Usha was the big icon when I was growing up. But there were no role models for sport, and especially women in sport. Maybe I should correct that. The 80s actually had a sudden, India suddenly did well in cricket. And Prakash Padukone, of course, won the All England Championship. But this is all male sport, and they were seen as outliers. I mean, Kapil Dev's team was seen as a anomaly winning. Everybody was surprised. So I came to running from the personal experience of grief. My grandmother had passed away, and I had thought that she would recover, and I hadn't traveled back to be with her. And the guilt and the grief of that moment, that decision, weighed very heavily on me. And I remember that I felt grief as a very heavy feeling, and I felt like I needed to shake this off. And for me, running was the easiest thing. And I lived in Delhi in those days. And in Delhi, if you live in these DDA colonies, then you have the advantage of little parks sometimes inside, and of course just the colony roads. So I began running from there. So that was the starting point. But this book actually has a number of, if you say, why did you write this book? It could have been an essay, an essay on running and grief and what running taught you. And it actually was an essay. But a number of things happened. So one of the things that happened was that in 2012-13, in the December of 2012-13, this 23-year-old paramedical student went to watch a screening of Life of Pi in Saket, and stepped out, got onto a bus, and was gang raped by 6 men, and then just flung out of the moving bus and left on the streets to fend for whatever, she and her friend. And I remember the reportage from that time mentioning many incidents, but particularly that one assailant or two assailants mentioned seeing a rope-like object which another assailant was handling, and that was, according to the doctors, her intestines. But this is not the only thing, that winter, I call it the winter of Jyoti Singh, actually. I said 23-year-old paramedical student also because, it's already 11 years. In a few days, it's going to be 11 years, and a lot of people may not remember who she was. And I don't like using the media given title for her. So it wasn't just the incident. It was also the conversations that happened after. Largely, there was a lot of anger that we saw in the studios of English and Hindi news channels, but especially English news channels. And there was a lawmaker who said, and there were protests, and there was a lawmaker who unforgettably said, the women who are participating in these protests are dented, painted. And I remember that, of course, I mean, I didn't find it particularly funny because I thought I was hearing that anyway around me, not in that particular phrase, but even in the conversations around me, in my family, on social media, at the edges of these conversations, I was still hearing what I call the three inevitable questions swirling around. So they were all very sympathetic to Jyoti, and everybody was amazed at the viciousness of the crime. But there were the three inevitable questions, which is, but what was she doing there? Where was she going? What was she wearing? And I remember that I call it the winter of Jyoti Singh, all these incidents together, rather than just her the vicious attack on her. I remember feeling like I wanted to, I had a physical reaction. I wasn't so much angry as I just wanted to go out on the streets and occupy them and say that, here I am, and this is me, I'm staying here, wearing this, going nowhere. In response to that chorus of doing what, wearing what, going where. So I felt like, get used to me, I don't want to have to give any more answers, we are going to be here. And I think I had this physical response rather than just anger. Or, of course, as a writer, I wrote, and as a journalist, I wrote, but it was more than just writing. I think because some years previously I had started running, and I had noticed, aside from what it did for me, my grief, the clarity of thought it gave me, and you're right, walking can give you the same clarity of thought. I knew from the way people looked at me, men and women both, that women were proscribed from public spaces in the subcontinent. We were not expected to be there. So we had to make ourselves as we had to sort of fold ourselves up as much as possible, and be as unintrusive as possible. So I think, this is why I had that, I connected it to running because I had that experience as a runner, and I felt like, so that was one of the early triggers. Another trigger was in 2016, I was reporting the assembly elections in West Bengal, and I was coming back from an afternoon rally, Padyatra by Mamata Banerjee, and her Padyatras are really like sprint yatras. You really have to run after her. And it's the April heat, it's cruel. I was coming back home, I had an umbrella, and a man, somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I looked back, and this man was like, fold your umbrella. And then he said, I couldn't believe it. Then he said, you're taking up the space of 3 people. So I pointed him to the parked cars on both sides of the road. This is central Calcutta, very, very dense. But also you have parked cars, you have lots of street vendors. And I pointed him to the hawkers and the parked cars. And I said, why don't you tell them to move? And he said, they are not disturbing anybody, or they are doing their work, or something, some nonsense like that. And at that time, I had probably done a couple of chapters. I was exploring this idea, what eventually became this book. But this man's, articulated entitlement, I'm very grateful to him, actually, that he did that. Because, most people would just do they would just be impatient and make noises and go. But this guy actually said, "You're taking up too much space. You don't deserve this space." And I thought that, I have to answer this question: women, public space, and our right to public space. And it seemed to me that the answer lay in, it was a question of citizenship to me, our citizenship in public space, which is a question of, are we equal citizens of a country that has given us the vote or not? And when I started to examine this idea, I had already done some examining. It's, to me, sports and nationalism are interconnected. They are inextricably interconnected, actually, because if you see the 20th century, which is the high noon of nationalism, that is, of course, when India became independent, all the colonies, it's the age of the age of empire comes to an end. And it's the age of nation states. Of course, French Revolution happened earlier, Americans became independent earlier, but I'm saying generally as a movement. And if you look at the turn of the 20th century, you'll also see that 1896 is the first edition of the modern Olympics. 1904, FIFA, which is the World Cup Association, the Football Association, comes into being. 1913 or 1912, the International Tennis Association's rules are set up. Sometime in the 1870s, the first international test match is played. So before nations line up, as we see the momentum for World War I gathering, we see already nations are lining up against one another on the sports field. So nationalism and sport is always on the basis of, pretty much on the basis of flag. You always play on. So this is the other side. And the other thing is that men can go to war, but women largely don't go to war. If you see the history of the suffragist movement, then mostly the most powerful movements were in the US and the UK. And the suffragists won serious gains, and they got the vote in 1918-19. Why? Because that is the end of the First World War, and women were seen as having done their bit during the war. They were seen as having filled in for men. So they were seen as, okay, you are worthy of getting the vote. But point 3, so one is sport and nationalism are inextricably linked. Point 2, men can perform nationalism by going to war. How do women perform it? Occasionally, like what First World War gave, the options that it gave women. Point 3, how do women perform nationalism at any moment without a time of war? So to me, that answer seemed to be sport. And so I thought, let me examine women and sport. And because India had a colonial experience, it became easier for me, because I just had to broadly see from the 1940s or the late 1930s, which is by which time we knew that sooner or later we would be independent. It could have been 47, it could have been 52, but we would be independent. So I traveled the decades from then to now through the lives of sportswomen. I could have looked at, and that thought had crossed my mind, because the better known sportswomen are all after 2000, right? 2000. There's Usha in 84, and then 2000 Kannam Malleshwari. But then basically it's Sania Mirza, Saina Nehwal, and then we have a flurry, Sindhu, Mary Kom, fantastic women, one after the other. But I thought, let me be systematic. Let me not look at badminton and wrestling and tennis, and anyway, that will bring me only to the last 25 odd years. I won't be able to tell the story of her. So I just thought, let me look at the simplest sport. In terms of equipment, running, you need nothing. Until about 5 years ago, the Athletics Federation of India didn't even require you to wear shoes on the track. Now that has changed. You don't even need a team. So that's why I thought, let me look at running. And also simultaneously, the 2010s were a time that it became very aspirational, this marathon running. So that was another reason. There was a Boston Marathon terrorist attack. So it seemed like running was the most democratic sport. So that is a very long answer, but it was actually, it's a long book. It took me a long time. So a lot of things happened, and it's, in many ways, it's a conceptual book. So I was just trying to explain the concept to you.
Um, so I wanted to ask, because you're also a journalist, and as being one, there is always this, that when you're talking to somebody, there is often this idea that you also have a deadline, that you also have certain mandates in place. That is how that's why you have set up this particular interview, right? And then all through the chapters, you were also telling about the challenge of getting somebody, because that's always a journalist's concern, right? Can you get this person to open up, to tell things that maybe somebody else hasn't reported as yet, right? And then there's, of course, the role of the writer, which is also what, because you were talking about the personal and the concepts that you just explained, what brought it all together. So I thought if you could tell us a bit about that, like where do these two sides, if we are going to call them two sides, that's it, that there's the writer, which is going to sit down and put all the thoughts together. And then there's also your your professional training, or your profession itself as a journalist, where you have this. And then you were talking about moments when there was a sense of guardedness for whatever experience some of the athletes had to go through, and that's why they were not opening, or there were moments when they were. And your then a sense of empathy would show, I feel like they were there in the words, in the way you were also writing. So I was wondering, how was it like the writing down and the interview bit, when, I mean, I would see them as slightly different challenges, where you have to also distill so many things you must have listened to. For example, if you're saying, if every Tuesday, if you're setting that up, it would take a kind of a headspace altogether to talk to somebody who lived in a different moment in history altogether. So probably just a sense of that.
So Anna, that's a good question. I think my journalism really helped me in the sense that, as journalists, we have this incredible confidence, right? Like we just pick up the phone and call people or text them, as it happens today, right? And like
Yeah.
we're just so imperious about it, as if, everybody's phone number is our business. It's our business to know. So I think that sort of intrepidity really helped me, because I didn't allow it to get in my way. Some people, of course, were fantastic. Like Usha is so used to journalists, and she was super professional. And more than anything else, whatever I may think about her, because today we've seen her for 40 plus years in the public domain, and now we see her as an administrator. But my admiration for her only went up, actually, because she's so professional. She knows exactly how to deal with journalists, and also she was really good in the sense that, if she had to say that, look, I cannot give you time, although I said I would give you time, she would say it, and I really appreciated that. But there were lots of people whom I really had to find out, and that is another journalistic skill, right? That we are very good at finding out and researching quickly.
Right.
That is a skill. Today journalists, people keep telling us that there is no, now it's the age of social media influencers and things like that. And I think journalists would make excellent social media influencers because we have incredible skills. We come with those skills that we learn on the job, the
Right.
ability to call people up, the ability to ferret out information really quickly. So those were absolute bonuses. But I mean, I had the best of both worlds. At the same time, I knew I was writing this as a book. And there was a time, because it took me so long, that I thought, if nothing else, I will self-publish it, because I owe it to most of the people in the book are not well known, other than Usha and to some extent Kamjit Sandhu. So I owe it to them, because they would ask me, and Duti, of course, that when are you publishing? When are you publishing? So as a writer, I think I knew that I have slightly more license, and I could write about these things that my editors would say, get rid of all this nonsense. What is this nonsense that you have written? What is this purple prose? But I could allow myself a bit of that thinking. At the same time, I have to say that my editors' voices inside my head helped me, because I think I went a little bit beyond what most narrative nonfiction writers in India tend to do. So I'm just now reading this wonderful a book called Mountain Tales by Soumya Rai, which is about this community of garbage pickers in Deonar in Bombay. And Soumya is also in the book. But she isn't in the book as prominently or as visibly as I am. So we tend to generally do that. We sort of like have that's what the Indian idea of journalism encourages. Um, and another example, but an example of somebody who did it really well is Sonia Fallero in Beautiful Thing, because she made herself into a character. But in her next book, The Good Girls, it's completely in the third person. So I think I went a little bit beyond Soumya and went more towards what Sonia Fallero did in Beautiful Thing with her book on bar dancers. Again, an excellent work of narrative nonfiction. But I think I had the best of both, really. I mean, my journalistic practices really helped me, and my training on the job really helped me, I think. And I was also really good with like following up with people, and I did many drafts of the book, but largely I think I was good with deadlines, self-set deadlines. So, today people say that, journalists are such a sorry lot, and, they have no jobs and they are propagandists, and some of us are. But, I think I have to say that I feel journalism gives you many skills, and you have to be aware of them. But I certainly, there are things that where I was less objective than I would have been if I wrote a journalistic piece. So I allowed myself to be a little less objective because I think, spending time with the person and knowing them gives you the license to say that, hey, we should not only go by what we see and the objective facts. There's a little more.
Okay. Yeah. So I was reminded of this phrase that I learned in bachelor's called autoerotic. And what it gave me is a sense of probably validation of some of the things that I would think of writing, but I would not, because I feel like it was a lot of me going on. And then as a kid or growing up or all around you, you're taught erasure, women's identity. I mean, your identity, even if you're doing great in whatever, it should not be too in your face. It should not be too bright and loud and all of those things, right? So for me, it stood out. And like I said, what held my fascination for a book was, I think, because you were talking about that sense of erasure. So, and then what you just mentioned about how you were choosing to write or how you're going to position the narrative in a way. I was wondering, how was it like also to sort of maybe often recover? Because there are moments which are deeply emotional, I would feel, even if they're not yours, maybe specifically. You're listening into somebody, and you just said that, yes, we are taught as journalists to be objective and listen in and not become a part of that experience immediately. But we are also human beings before we are journalists. And as women, we are also, there's a sense of empathy that sort of is nurtured, or maybe, I don't know how else to put it probably. But how was it like in that sense? Because I feel like it took a long time, yes, but there were so many interviews, so many trips you made, so many travels that you had to so many corners, probably half of which I've never heard of before this book. And I was reading through, and I was wondering, what was your process like of dealing and coping in a sense? Because it must have also taken a toll of a certain kind, because you were talking about your personal, but you were also listening to so many personal accounts of women. And I mean, going back to the very simplistic notion of personal being political, which you've also said, wow, the concepts behind the book. So I was wondering, what was your way of sort of going through when you're done with that interview and you realize the pain and whatever struggles this person has gone through? So, how do you remove and yet remain true to what you really want to, like your vision of the book, for example? Yeah.
I'll tell you, I mean, I'll answer your question, but you have to explain what autoerotic is, because I don't know it, and maybe some of your viewers also don't know it, or maybe I know it, but I don't know the term. But I'll give you my answer first. It wasn't something that I had to recover from, or because as you already said it, is that their experiences resonated with me. There were experience, and I've tried to bring that up as well. Yes, of course, what happened to Shanti Soundarajan is unimaginable. And the humiliation was at an international scale. I cannot say that I have been subjected in that way, and that is why in that chapter I have not brought it up in the extent that I may have brought up in subsequent or other chapters. But mostly it resonated uh, because we all go through micro humiliations. So whether it's erasure of the self or whether it's just keep quiet or whatever, there are so many things. Whether it's a man telling me, please fold your umbrella, you're taking up the space of. So you're always told to, fold yourself up in various ways, either to shut up or physically. So largely it resonated. Also, I think Shanti Soundarajan's chapter was the last one I did as a reporter in terms of reportage. And I had a lot of time to think about it. Shanti featured in my proposal right from the beginning, and it took a very long time to convince her, which is understandable because media coverage, even the best intentioned media coverage, even very high quality media coverage, has cost her so much. So by the time I spoke with her, I had already replayed it so much in my mind. And then Shanti also made it very easy for me because she was very frank. So I think maybe that is who she is as a person today. She has accepted what has happened to her and who she is. But also, I think that I had so much time to think about it that it wasn't so much of a it wasn't so much for me to deal with.
Right.
So that is what, nothing really other than hers. I mean, of course, I read her story many times. So other than that middle section of women who are called out for not being women enough in various ways. This is broadly speaking. You're told you have too much testosterone, as Doti Chand was told. I thought about it so much that it didn't affect me as much as you may think. But I think because I had put myself in the story, I knew that I would be tapping into what I thought myself about this thing. But do tell us, what is autoerotic?
I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, I just hope I am because otherwise, I think it was, if I'm not wrong, I think it was N. Sexton's one of the texts. And basically, what I remember from that explanation is when you're looking at yourself, like if I'm an author and I can talk about myself in a first person narrative, let's say, I can talk about myself in a way that I usually hear somebody else talking about me, maybe in a more sensual manner, where I am describing myself. I'm looking at myself and I'm describing, okay, this is where my body curves and it looks amazing, for example, if I'm writing. Now the thing is, before that, obviously, I would think this is somebody else should be writing like this. If I'm writing like this, then I'm too full of myself then. Like, what am I thinking of myself? But I think that twist, like I said, gave me that confidence, which eventually I tried to develop over time that, okay, before somebody else tells you that this is how good you look or this is how great you write, maybe do it for yourself. Like this whole narrative of self-love that we have now, because Instagram has blown up, social media has blown up, so we are all going by it. And there's a greater validation, especially for women, that it's okay to take care of yourself before you take care of 20 other people in your life. I think, yeah, that is where I would say it began for me, very slowly, in a girls' college, where I realized, okay, it is okay. On those days that you stand in front of the mirror for like 2 hours, it's not okay, because that's what we'd also be told. And how much are you going to look into the mirror, study or something like that, growing up.
Yeah,
So
no, I mean, it's totally worth it. I don't know how long you stayed in front of the mirror today, but you look great and I'm happy.
Whole different story going on today before coming out, but not as much. But thank you so much. And I wish you could keep stretching this, but I also have unfortunately a time deadline for how long I can conduct the video interview. But like I said, I think I had just so many questions. I think we could just end and I'll ask you one more if it's okay with you, if you do have the time.
Of course.
Okay. So I'll just end the session then. Thank you so much for giving us a detailed manner, because I don't think we often get to know, what goes behind the writing of a book, we get often very like limited answers. I think this is a good window for me to also understand as a reader. Like the second time I probably read the book or read some sections of it, I think this will come to my mind about these concepts. And I think they stand out to me also as a woman, probably. Like I said, because it's about a woman, it's a writer who's talking to me and talking about her experiences shaping a narrative. And I would say reading this, how it impacts me as again a woman, I think those are also interlinked as a reader. So thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I mean, it's a pleasure to talk about the process of writing this book, because most people ask about, and that is how it is with nonfiction. They will ask you about the subject and the people you have chosen to write about. And I think those are also important. So if I may have a minute, I would say that this is a book that tells the history of modern India, independent India from the 1940s to this moment through the lives of 8 women athletes, beginning with Mary D'Souza. And then we have Kamaljit Sandhu in the 1970s. We have Usha. Then we have 3 women who are called out for not being women. Shanti Soundarajan, Pinky Pramanik, Duti Chand. Then we have Lalita Babar, who is the first Indian woman to qualify for an Olympic track and field final after Usha. And then I write about this long distance running school. I talk about the girls there and what the school means to them, but what the marathon economy has meant to cash starved, impoverished rural districts. And then I end the book because I was writing it in 2020 during the first lockdown. Through much of that year. And if you remember, that was a time there were lots of images of migrant workers, rotis strewn on a train track, somebody seemingly snatching food from a dog. So I chose to end with the story of Ila Mitro, although chronologically hers would have been the first. She may have been the first Indian origin woman to go to the Olympics. But the Olympics were cancelled for the World War II. So I chose to end with that because I thought I needed some hope. I remember being very battered by social media because either it was my world was very privileged and I would see people making sourdough bread and Dalgona coffee, if you remember that year. And on the other hand, and there's nothing wrong with that. I had very much the same kind of experience. And the other thing was that, you see these rotis on the ground, on the train tracks, 12 people or 8 people have died because they were sleeping there. Men and women crying on the highways. So it was just such a dissonance. And I remember feeling, and I'm also, as you said, a journalist. So as a health reporter, I was getting a lot of calls, panic calls. That was not the year COVID struck us, but there were lots of chronic health patients, people who are on the HIV program, the ART program for AIDS and other chronic disease patients, end stage organ disease. And I was feeling very helpless and I needed to end on a note of hope. And I thought I would end it with the story of Ila Mitra because 1940s India was so devastating, really. We think of it as, the year, the decade we got independence. And maybe some may think 1942 quit India. But it was a decade that battered India with the Bengal famine and the partition. And then Gandhi was killed in 1948. So, but despite that, I wanted to say that, things can go from ruin and devastation to something like hope. So I end with that story. So that's like the more banal part of my book. And you talk to me about the process of writing the book, which is far more interesting to me. Thank you.